The EPA is disastrous plan to end the regulation of greenhouse gases. In a shocking turn of events, the Trump administration has set its sights on dismantling a landmark ruling that has been the cornerstone of federal efforts to curb greenhouse gas emissions. 19 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a narrow 5-4 decision, ruled in Massachusetts versus Environmental Protection Agency that the Clean Air Act mandates the EPA to assess whether greenhouse gases pose a threat to public welfare and, if so, regulate them. This ruling, hailed by Harvard Law School professor Richard J. Lazarus as the most significant environmental law case ever decided by the court, paved the way for the endangerment finding in 2009, which has since underpinned federal limitations on carbon pollution. Now, the Trump administration seeks to overturn this critical decision, or at the very least, defy it. Last week, they unveiled the plan to revoke the endangerment finding, a move that, if successful, could be the most extensive deregulatory action in U.S. history, according to EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin. This repeal, if it withstands the inevitable legal challenges, would not only nullify several sets of Obama-era regulations aimed at reducing emissions from vehicles and power plants, but also make it nearly impossible for future administrations to tackle emissions without new legislation from Congress. The primary beneficiary of this latest EPA maneuver is the fossil fuel industry, which has been granted virtually every wish under the Trump administration. The recent trade deal with the European Union includes a pledge by the EU to purchase hundreds of millions of dollars worth of oil and liquefied natural gas from the U.S. Moreover, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, passed by Congress, bestowed new or expanded tax incentives to oil and gas companies, amounting to an estimated $18 billion. As Michael Gerard, faculty director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia, succinctly put it, "We are becoming a petrostate." The administration's attempt to rescind the endangerment finding is a brazen display of catering to the fossil fuel industry while simultaneously disregarding scientific consensus. The EPA's proposal to repeal the finding, released last Tuesday, heavily relies on a report commissioned by the Department of Energy from a select group of scientists known for their contrarian views on climate change. This 141-page assessment downplays the risks associated with climate change, often in ways that contradict its own data. Several climate scientists whose work is cited in the report have publicly stated that their conclusions are misrepresented. Zeke Housefather, one of the cited scientists, told Wired that the assessment appears more like a blog post, a somewhat scattershot collection of oft-debunked skeptic claims, studies taken out of context, or cherry-picked examples that are not representative of broader climate science research findings. Repealing the endangerment finding on scientific grounds is now an absurd proposition, given the overwhelming evidence since 2009 that climate change poses a significant threat to public welfare. On the very day the report and the EPA's proposal were released, over 11 million Americans were under a rare extreme heat warning from the National Weather Service. Harvard law professor Lazarus dismissed the administration's scientific arguments as frivolous, but noted that their legal arguments, centered on interpreting the Clean Air Act, could resonate with the current Supreme Court. With 3 of the dissenters from Massachusetts versus EPA, John Roberts, Samuel Alito, and Clarence Thomas, still on the bench, and 3 Trump appointees, Brett Kavanaugh, Neil Gorsuch, and Amy Coney Barrett, joining them, the legal landscape looks favorable for the administration's agenda. The only silver lining some legal experts can find is that the repeal could have unintended consequences for the fossil fuel industry. Patrick Parenteau, a professor emeritus at Vermont Law and Graduate School, pointed out on The Conversation that many cities and states have filed climate-related lawsuits against major oil companies. The industry's strongest defense against these lawsuits is that they are preempted by federal law, specifically the Clean Air Act. However, If the administration argues that the Clean Air Act does not permit the EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, this preemption argument loses its strength. Rescinding the endangerment finding could backfire on the fossil fuel industry, Parenteau observed. However, other legal scholars are not convinced. They argue that the states' and cities' lawsuits would also face a hostile Supreme Court. While the argument is theoretically sound, one cannot help but worry about the potential outcomes. The Trump administration's assault on the endangerment finding is a bold move that could have far-reaching consequences for climate policy in the United States. But here's where it gets controversial. Could this be a strategic blunder that inadvertently empowers states and cities to take legal action against the fossil fuel industry? And this is the part most people miss. The legal battles that will ensue could redefine the landscape of climate regulation in the U.S. for decades to come. What are your thoughts on this? Do you believe the administration's actions will ultimately benefit or harm the fossil fuel industry? Share your views in the comments below. Trump's E.P.A. proposal, the end of U.S. climate change fight. Imagine a world where the very foundation of climate policy is under attack. That's exactly what's happening under the Trump administration, which has been relentlessly trying to dismantle climate regulations since day one. The latest move? The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, has proposed to rescind its 2009 endangerment finding, a scientific conclusion that greenhouse gases contribute to global warming and harm human health and well-being. This isn't just another regulatory rollback. It's an assault on the cornerstone of all federal climate policy. But here's where it gets controversial. The endangerment finding originally applied to vehicle emissions, but it also underpins every major federal climate rule in America. Car and truck emissions standards, power plant regulations, and limits on oil and gas facilities. By removing this cornerstone, Trump's EPA is repudiating federal authority to limit greenhouse gases, our most powerful tool for fighting climate change. The irony is that no industry asked for this extreme step. Car makers need stable federal rules to compete globally. Power companies have invested billions in renewable energy, which regulatory uncertainty puts at risk. Even most oil and gas companies support a national approach to limiting methane. Companies may stay quiet to avoid crossing a vengeful administration, but they know climate change is real and that some federal regulation makes business sense. As the federal government retreats, states such as California will try to fill the void. But Trump is trying to block them too, directing the Justice Department to challenge state climate policies. With its cap and trade program, renewable energy standards, and clean transportation incentives, California is helping to cut harmful emissions, and it could do more. Yet even the most ambitious state measures can't substitute for the national standards needed to tackle a problem the size of climate change. The legal foundation the administration is attacking seemed unshakable. The Clean Air Act requires the EPA to regulate air pollutants that endanger human health and welfare. In 2007, in Massachusetts versus EPA, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that greenhouse gases are air pollutants and that the endangerment decision must be based on science. 2 years later, after the EPA reviewed studies by the National Climate Assessment, the National Research Council, and the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it found that greenhouse gases accumulating in the atmosphere are a danger, pointing to higher temperatures, worse air quality, extreme weather events, spreading drought, and more food and waterborne pathogens. Following the process set out in the Clean Air Act, the agency then established national emission standards for the sources in each sector of the U.S. economy that contribute to this problem. To unravel all of this, the Trump administration proposal offers a medley of strained legal and scientific arguments. First, it claims that greenhouse gases are not pollutants because they have global, not local effects. This argument is hard to square with the Supreme Court's ruling to the contrary, but they are trying it anyway. The proposal also asserts that U.S. emissions don't contribute to harms from climate change because climate impacts are too remote and American emissions are too small a share of the global total to matter. The first point demands a direct link between U.S. emissions and specific climate impacts, which is impossible to prove, given that the effects of climate change are the result of global pollution from numerous sources. The second point rests on a contrived method for calculating emissions piecemeal, which makes them appear vanishingly small. No category of sources, whether cars or power plants, would produce a large enough share of greenhouse gases to justify regulation under this approach. It's a test designed to be impossible to pass. Studies show, to the contrary, that every ton of emissions avoided counts when it comes to reducing climate risks, and that even incremental reductions bring significant public health and economic gains. The proposal goes on to attack the scientific basis for the endangerment finding, calling it unreliable based largely on a report from the Department of Energy, written by 5 hand-picked scientists known for their outlier views. The report asserts, among other things, that global warming is on balance more beneficial than harmful, that cold temperatures are the greater threat, and that extreme weather events are not worse than they have been historically. To say that such claims defy the consensus is an understatement. Relying on a commission report by a closed group looks especially suspect, given that Trump disbanded the National Climate Assessment, a congressionally mandated periodic review conducted by hundreds of climate scientists and involving more than a dozen government agencies, which has warned of climate dangers in 5 reports since 2000. The proposal also folds policy objections into the scientific assessment, asserting that regulating greenhouse gases simply costs too much and accomplishes too little. But this muddles the issues. Whether climate change is harmful is a purely scientific assessment. How stringently to regulate is a separate question that must weigh both costs and benefits. On that score, the proposal's cost analysis is highly skewed, citing the burdens of regulation while ignoring the substantial public health and economic benefits of limiting warming. In all, the proposal's scattershot justifications seem designed to offer the conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court, where the issue will likely land, a variety of ways to agree. After all, the 5 members of the Massachusetts versus E.P.A. majority have retired or died, while 3 of the 4 dissenters remain. The current court has steadily limited that decision's reach by narrowing the E.P.A.'s authority. Given their recent rulings, the justices could well reject the proposal's most far-fetched arguments while concluding that the E.P.A. simply has broad discretion not to regulate greenhouse gases. Even if the administration ultimately loses in court, it wins by paralyzing climate action for years. As E.P.A. Administrator Lee Zeldin put it in announcing the proposal, the administration is driving a dagger through the heart of climate change religion. But climate change isn't a religion, it's physics and chemistry. And science doesn't care about politics. We can't solve climate change with regulation alone. But we certainly can't solve it by pretending the problem doesn't exist. The administration's assault on climate action won't change the evidence or reality of climate change. As scientists have predicted, storms are growing more intense, heat waves more deadly, wildfires more destructive. We spend billions annually on disaster response, while other countries surge ahead in clean energy innovation and manufacturing. China now dominates solar panel and electric vehicle production. Europe leads in offshore wind. The question isn't whether we'll eventually return to responsible climate policy. We will, because we must. The question is how much time we'll lose and how much damage we'll suffer while politics masquerades as good policy. And this is the part most people miss. The administration's actions are not just about policy. They are about the future of our planet. So, what do you think? Is this a necessary step towards economic growth or a dangerous retreat from environmental responsibility? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.